Thank you and good afternoon to everyone here again. Two things, of course, the afternoon session is going to be difficult for the lunch reason, and also I find the temperature is too low, which can actually force people to get out of the room. So my request, I have requested personally also to the organizers here to get the temperature right so that our carbon footprint is better. I would not say zero, but it's better. In this session, we have actually very esteemed speakers, and I would not take too much of time, but since I have been given the task of moderating, just wanted to make few statements before we start this session. We are talking about climate change vulnerability and risk-related issues. What is important here to understand that when recent IPCC released this document of what you call it, summary for policymakers, it is very important to note that overall carbon budget, which has been discussed many times but not highlighted as strongly as it should be, that almost of the total budget, almost four-fifths of that has been already utilized. So why we say immediate action and urgent action which needs to be done is because if we don't do for this 1/5 remaining, we would have exceeded this whole limit thing that we are talking about 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. So that's the very important thing. And the second very important thing, since we are discussing about finance, climate finance, people do get confused with finance with investment and loan. And these all 2-3 words have actually different meaning. Finance does not mean investment, investment does not mean finance, and loan does not mean investment. So, in climate debate, these words are very important because if the country doesn't understand, the cities don't understand, the stakeholders don't, the chances are that we'll be misled by these wordings which are being used. And lastly, when we talk about risk assessment, risk for now or risk which has happened. So something which some of the countries, the cities which have suffered and are suffering because of the impact, what cost it is and who is bearing those costs. And that is where the issue of climate finance, climate support, and climate-related technological issues come in. So I'll not take much of time, and immediately we'll start with Mr. SVR Srinivas, who is MMRDA Commissioner. He was there this morning here in this room itself, but he's going to speak on this topic on online right now because he had another meeting. So may I request the organizers to get him online, and after that we'll request Dr. Atul Bakay, who has to again leave for another meeting with the minister. He will immediately come on the dais here and speak with all of you. So let's start. Thank you.
Good afternoon all. I hope I am audible. Yeah. Good afternoon everybody, and a warm welcome in the afternoon once again to the conference. And I begin where the point left by finance and then come to the adaptations and vulnerability assessments and capacity building. So climate finance obviously refers to the investment that we would do or financing methods and the methodologies that we have so that the adaptation to risks and adaptation to, and mitigation actions, how they are going to be financed. And of course, this is, for example, to incentivize investments in and development in renewable energy, for example. That is one of the things. And for example, sustainable agriculture, right? That is another, and other adaptation to climate change. And it obviously includes investments, but how to incentivize them? That is the issue, actually. So instead of going to a carbon-based energy, I would like to go to, let us say, solar-based or other based. How to investment? That is an adaptation. But at the moment, luckily, our costs have come down per unit as far as solar is concerned. But however, other forms also need incentivization for adaptation and mitigation. Now coming to the topic on hand, it's a very two topics we have chosen. One is climate change vulnerability and risk assessment and capacity building, and both are of course follow one after the other. In fact, parallelly also they should be looked into and they should be addressed. And in fact, if you want to assess even vulnerability and assess the risk in coastal cities, for example, you also need capacity building. Now coming specifically to coastal cities, like for example, we have cities like Mumbai and Chennai and many other cities in India. I'll just take to Indian context. Basically, what they should do in the vulnerability assessment is the point that I have made in the morning. I would like to repeat. The most important is not to look at cities in isolation. Basically, we should see it as a region because city is an administrative unit, but it also, especially metropolitan cities, have metropolitan regions. Not because I'm metropolitan commissioner, but that's true. So there is the peri-urban area becomes very, very important. In fact, that is many times the shock absorber, right? And they also bear the brunt of many times the climate change, the adverse effects. So we should have a plan and we should have the assessment of the vulnerability and risk assessment for the region as a whole. So this city plan, a city infrastructure plan, city adaptation plan, risk assessment and vulnerability assessment and the adaptation method should be actually segued into the regional framework. So unless we do that, because each city in isolation will not be able to successfully do that. That is my opinion, because as I said just now, the cities, the climate and environment do not respect administrative boundaries. So in that context, in the morning, in fact, I can see Sri Atulji Bakay sir here. So we are actually will be preparing very soon the environment action plan for metropolitan region along with UNEP with their technical support and cooperation. And second is, for that, risk assessment includes not only as a practitioner and as a urban practitioner for last 2 decades. I would like to say it does not a vague idea. It has to be, for example, when we do the stormwater, for example, there is something called the proper level of the stormwater flow from the minor drains to major drains to the sea, for example here. So the levels have to be seen, and what will be the levels in future, what will be the levels now. For example, Mumbai is above sea level, all right, but once it comes to what we are, hopefully if it doesn't come through, it's all right, but in case it comes through that level where sea level rises, and how the pumping stations will work, for example, in Mumbai, and whether the water will only flow back like Miti River, it happens every 12 hours. There is always a backwash effect that always happens, and Mumbai has 3-4 rivers which can actually damage in a significant way. So vulnerabilities has to include studies of the systems of stormwater, for example, which of course BMC is doing through the WRI, and also the other areas like, for example, water. Like water, for example, in India, especially Mumbai, I stick myself as a practitioner to Mumbai only. Water is, of course, Mumbai has adequate water, but nonetheless, this is all rain-based water. But we don't know what will be the future will look like, and not fundamentally proved as yet. But then we have to go to other areas. As to, for example, morning it was mentioned about desal, for example. So these are the risks and these are the vulnerabilities that are going to come. In addition to, of course, the very basic, like for example, residential areas, commercial areas being affected very badly. So I hope this discussion carries forward in that respect, and I'll take just one more minute and stop. That is regarding the building institutional capacity to mitigate risks. This is actually the very, very important. I would like to request Mr. Bakay to actually cooperate with, coordinate and technically guide the various ULBs, urban local bodies especially. Because I have seen it, it is actually in the last 1 year or 2 years only actually it is coming up. Otherwise, it is not even in discussion. When I was in BMC, for example, about even 6-7 years back, I was there for 4 years. It was not even discussed. Now, of course, it is coming on the agenda. But the point is, the capacity building is a long way to go. So, how to do that at what level, at different levels, cutting across departments? Because each one of us is in a different field. For example, solid waste is a different field. SWD is different. And building permissions department, town planning, it's very, very important to sensitize town planning department while giving permissions. And they to ensure that regional plan, the development plan sync with the climate action plan actually. So these type of things have to be built into the capacities of the organizations, not necessarily only individuals, but capacities of organizations. There, I am sure MMRD will support the initiative of Mumbai First and others. And I am sure this discussion today will carry forward and come out with some logical conclusions. I think that's enough for now. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivas ji, for wonderful initiative and whatever metropolitan issues which are there, which needs to be integrated with the city plan, and that actually needs a lot of capacity building where all the department needs to come together. So thank you for being precise on this direction. Earlier some attempts were done, and I'm sure they were not very successful, and therefore there is a need to re-look at all of them together. So may I now request, without losing much time, to listen to Dr. Atul Bakay, who does not need any introduction. He is with UNEP for a long time, and he is heading India operation. And he is very knowledgeable person, known to all of us who are in this domain. So let's hear from him. Please come.
Good afternoon, everyone. And as the MC said, I've been given the very difficult job of keeping you all awake after a very heavy lunch. And as the last speaker before lunch, the Japanese Consul General was saying that it was difficult for him to keep you away from lunch, and he had to hurry up. I have an equally difficult task of keeping you awake after a very good lunch. And thanks to Climate First for and Mumbai First for inviting us to UNEP to participate in this very, very important event which is being organized. And thanks, Rakesh ji, for also introducing UNEP and me. I was just thinking, I was listening to the speakers since the morning, and I was very impressed with the presentation which set the tone for the day by Rajat. And subsequent speakers also were talking about the problem, about the various aspects of the problem, especially how it impinges upon a coastal city like Mumbai, and what is the magnitude of the problem, what is going to happen in the next 100 years or 50 years. But I think what we need to do now is to move away from the academics of the problem and to move into action. I think that is what is really needed today. In fact, when we sit down and talk about what needs to be done, there are hundreds of actions that we should have taken yesterday. So we are already very, very late. I was listening to the Consul General from Netherlands, who was saying that in 1953, they made their dikes taking into account the problems they were facing with flooding. There was an excellent example of Singapore, of how they were making Singapore climate resilient 25 years back. And I think India needs to get into action mode as quickly as possible. So I'll try to, while give a context, try to focus a little bit on solutions that we should be really looking at. I think we talk about climate change, which is really taking over the whole narrative of environmental mitigation. And we need to understand, and this is something what our Secretary General and our Executive Director keep on talking about, a triple planetary crisis. The crisis of climate, the crisis of pollution, and the crisis of nature. But the way climate change has taken over the whole environmental debate, the other two crises largely get, I won't say sidelined, but they don't get the kind of focus they also deserve, because they are equally challenging crises that we are all facing. And at one level, all the three crises are interlinked also. They are interconnected. So while we are looking at solutions for nature, we are also benefiting the climate and vice versa. So I think what we need to really look at is a holistic approach, and if we have webinars and events like this, we should really be looking at all the three crises in a synergetic manner rather than just looking at one of them. And with that view in mind, we recently signed a MOU with Maharashtra government, with the Honorable Minister, to see how Maharashtra could look at this whole crisis in a holistic manner. And the Honorable Minister in his remarks in the morning was talking of a lot of implementation approaches they are looking at in terms of bringing agencies together, bringing partners together, bringing stakeholders together. And the Maji Vasundhara is a very good example of how the three crises are being looked at from the lens of mitigation at a level where all three build on the strengths or they help each other. I was also listening to Mr. Srinivas in his opening remarks, and I think he raised a very important point. In fact, he raised two very important points, and I would like to, that's where bring in my first reference of a solution of looking not at a city. So if you're looking at Mumbai, you need to look at a sub-region around Mumbai also. And I think that approach, for example, in the whole area of air pollution, is fast becoming the golden standard in terms of looking at a regional air pollution apportionment rather than a city air pollution apportionment. Because a lot of areas around the city have an impact on the air pollution levels of a particular city. And this would be true for also the other two crises of pollution, the waste problem or the climate change problem. For example, the waste problem, if you're looking at Mumbai, there would be a lot downstream and upstream avenues of pollution, pollution that would be getting into Mumbai. So I think that's a very important point Mr. Srinivas raised, that in whatever solutions we are looking at, we really need to look at not just a city, but also a watershed area around the city. And this is something that we've done recently in Agra, where with the help of IIT Kanpur, we've done an apportionment study where we are not looking at apportionment of air pollution causes for the Agra city itself, but also for the watershed around Agra, which could run into 100 or 150 square kilometer area around that city. So I think as a solution, that is an approach that needs to be followed by the environmentalists, by the government, and by the civil society also. The capacity building point which Srinivas raised is certainly most important point in everything, and I will come to that a little later when I'm talking of individual action. For a coastal city like Mumbai, a lot of discussions were happening in the morning on the heat issues increasing heat issues in Mumbai, and not only Mumbai, but I think the whole northern belt right now is undergoing a very major heat wave. I remember my very first posting as a subdivisional magistrate was in a district called Jhansi in Bundelkhand area in Uttar Pradesh, where in 1984 the temperatures in Jhansi city for 3 to 4 months used to touch 50 plus in 84. Right now they're touching 55 or even more. And the whole district administration used to come to a standstill at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. We used to start our office and courts at 6 in the morning, and we were back at home by 12 o'clock. And from 12 to 7, there used to be no work, there used to be no one on the streets, and everything used to be at a standstill. Now, if cities like Mumbai or Delhi or Patna are going to reach 50 or 50 plus, is that the kind of adaptation we can visualize for these cities, that they shut down at 12 o'clock in the afternoon? Because you can't just go out after that without the fear of a major heat stroke and the associated health costs that would be there. So I think we really need to look at how the heat aspect for a coastal city like Mumbai is going to be addressed. And there are very good examples that are happening now, while we were all talking about cooling plans over the last 10 years, because Mumbai also, there are studies that have shown that Mumbai will have the highest energy demand by 2030 in the world, even far ahead of Beijing. And that's the kind of cooling demand that Mumbai needs in the coming years. And now we are also talking of heat. aspects. So Ahmedabad, for example, has now developed a heat plan. And there's a lot of talk going on across various cities of whether heat plans can be made. And we are moving away now from just looking at cooling plans, but also looking at heat plans. And I think that is one aspect that needs to be looked at by the Mumbai cars to how that can be really addressed. So it will not just be adaptation aspects, but it will be aspects of also how to reduce heat by forest cover or whatever. And that's where the linkage with the nature crisis also comes in. And that's the second area where we need to really look at solutions which are nature-based. And there's a lot of work going on, and we're trying to start some work in Maharashtra and in Mumbai for some of these large cities. How can we find nature-based solutions that will help in reducing heat and also increasing cooling without recourse to mechanical instruments like air conditioners or such. In terms of solutions, and I think that is where, and I come to the plastic crises, the plastic and the pollution crises. And I was talking to the managing director of Morgan Stanley, and he was talking to me about some innovation they're doing in the route to Kedarnath of collecting plastic waste and aggregating it, and how they're doing that through a company called Recycle. And India is full of examples like this of how you can manage your plastic pollution. I think those solutions are the ones that need to be scaled up. We hear a lot about a very small experiment that is happening in Assam, for example, where school children are invited to bring plastic waste from their house to the school. So the school becomes the aggregator, and all those school children who are able to bring plastic waste for the 20 working days, school days of a month, they don't have to give fees to the school. And the school manages the plastic waste and sells it off and recoups the kind of money they lose by not taking fees. But it's a very beautiful example of how you can find solutions without actually getting into millions of dollars for these aspects. And if this can be scaled up to the entire country, you will have 30 crore students as a willing workforce for collecting waste from each and every household. So I think we need to start thinking of these things also. And my final point about solutions is how policy can impact on solutions. We recently were working with the Ministry of Finance on building a sustainable public procurement policy for the country. And I have some friends here from PwC who've been working with us in the past on these issues. Rajiv is there. And we recently experimented on two products, paper and air conditioners. And with the help of the governmental e-marketing system, the GEM, they put green ACs on their portal for purchases by various government departments. And the specifications, we took almost a year to work out those specifications. But I'm very happy to say that within 10 months, $10 million worth of air conditioners were picked up from the GEM portal. That's huge. So there is a market for green products. The government departments were keen to take over these things, and the private market also would have taken from GEM. But I think a policy nudge like that, and what the minister was saying in the morning, that he's issued instructions that all government vehicles which they're going to rent or buy now should be electric vehicles. If government can do that, it's going to make a huge dent in the market. My final request, and that's where the capacity building part came, is that we need not wait for the governments or the industry to take action on climate. I think each and everyone has a responsibility to take action on an individual basis and start working on it. An idiom that your champion of the earth, Afroz Shah, talks a lot when he works in Versova Beach. He said, I didn't wait for the government to clean the beach. I took it upon myself to do it. So if everyone, each one of us can look at environmental mitigation from that lens, I think that's going to make the biggest change, an immediate change. And I often end with saying that in the Indian tradition, there is so much of respect for nature. When we get off our bed in the morning and touch Mother Earth for the first time in the morning, we first beg forgiveness from Mother Earth that my feet are touching you, which is not a very good thing to do. And this is how we start our day. So I think we need to bring or integrate this respect for nature into our mindset, and this is what is going to make that change. This is what is going to help all cities in India and the world, and I think that change needs to start with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. An applause for him, and since he has to leave, I would request if we can take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if you have, because we will have to allow him to leave the stage. Anyone? Yes, Rishi, please.
Why don't we just give him a mic?
Hello. Yeah, thanks. My name is Rishi Agarwal. I'm an environmental activist, been active in cities issues for more than 20 years. So, Dr. Bakay, I just wanted to, not so much a question, but as much as some introspection and remarks. When you mentioned that Assam scheme, in that particular year, 2018, we launched something called as Safai Bank of India, and desperately tried to reach out to the UN agencies to support in scaling up. Fantastically simple program. But in my 20 years of activism and being involved with environmental issues, I found it very difficult to engage with UN agencies. And when you mentioned examples like Afroz, I've known Afroz for 20 odd years now, and he picked up one single beach, and we cleaned up that same beach in the year 2005-06 using municipal corporation machinery. So I tend to disagree with this whole thing that people should take up on themselves. I mean, BMC is the richest municipal corporation in the city, huge budget, and we had coined a suggestion that time called as don't mop the floor but fix the leak. So when there's so much of plastic landing up on Versova Beach, it is because some of us have been advocating for 20 years that the whole Mallard Creek upstream, huge amount of slum colonies are throwing waste on a daily basis because the municipal corporation does not serve them, because they do not pay taxes, and the municipal corporation says that we cannot service places which do not pay taxes, and these people stay in almost rooms which are the size of this table where I'm standing right now, or double the size, and they have no option but to throw it into the next door Nali. So I'm saying there needs to be some introspection in the UN agencies, I think, and we're not going to be able to scale up.
No, there was a request from Chandika that.
Yeah, actually, I've just made my point. I don't know, there's some disturbance. But so I think I just wanted to, since we have this platform and I have you here as of now, but I would love to meet you separately and discuss a lot more.
No, certainly, let's meet separately. On the UN agency part, meaning I'm not going to defend anyone because meaning we are also a bureaucracy like any other bureaucracy, and it takes a lot of effort to move bureaucracies, whether they are government or international agencies. And I must also say one thing, meaning I moved back to India about 4 years back. I left 22 years back, 26 now. And after coming back, when we set up this office, frankly, and like today's, what I've been hearing since morning, I've been amazed over the last 4 years as to how much of wealth of knowledge, experience is there in this country. And I introspect with my team very often, are we really needed in a country like India? Okay, is there any value that I can add to what's already going on, except for probably giving a speech like this or trying to motivate people or bringing examples from across the country or across the world. And I think I agree that the way Indian economy and Indian knowledge has grown over the last 2-3 decades, the roles of the UN agencies have also changed drastically. I don't see now India looking at UN agencies or World Bank or ADB with the same lens as they used to look, let's say 20 years back or 30 years back. And that is certainly, we are also grappling with this in terms of finding our space where we are needed. So I will certainly align with you on your frustration in terms of how to bring UN agencies, because we are grappling with a similar kind of an issue also. On the other issues of, I didn't say that individual action is the only thing that will make the change. What I said was, while governments and industry are doing their jobs, or if they are, that is not going to be sufficient. I think unless each and every individual starts also contributing. In the morning they were talking about, I think Srinivas was talking about a regional environmental action plan to be made for Mumbai, Navi Mumbai and those areas. And I was just thinking that we at a government level or even at an international agency level, we talk of through the government making such action plans. I think there's a need to make an individual household environmental action plan for each and every household. That's very, very critical. You and I, when we leave our houses in the morning, are we aware as to what damage we are going to do over the day and what can we do to mitigate that? And I think an individual action plan is something which is also very critical. There are problems downstream and upstream, as you rightly pointed out, on dumping, and as there's no other options available. And I think we need to find solutions to those. Afroz Shah, I just gave an example because I know the efforts that have been made in Mumbai in beaches in the past 20-30 years. But then these efforts are still going on. Meaning once you've cleaned up a beach, you should be in a position that you don't have to do it every weekend or every week or every day. But then our individual actions are the ones, I won't blame BMC completely that despite the funding they have, they are not being able to manage this, and there are many other issues about the government. But I think we also as an individual, if we can manage ourselves better despite the problems that you're raising, we might be able to mitigate some of those problems, though not completely.
So, thank you, Dr. Bakay. These are complex issues, probably will require a full session on this whole thing. So we will stop here because we have to also take other speakers. Thank you, Dr. Bakay. And since you have to leave, thank you very much. So next speaker we have is Professor Parth Sarthi, who is professor at IIT Bombay and who is also faculty of the climate group which is there at IIT Bombay, and he is extensively working in this field. So may I request Professor Parth Sarthi, please go ahead. So we have about 5 to 7 minutes to make major points, and if you have any specific thing that we can take it in Q&A. Professor Parth Sarthi, please.
Yeah, thank you. So am I audible? Can you all hear me in the room?
Professor Parth Sarthi, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I have a presentation. Is it visible? I've shared it just now.
Not yet. We saw the slide, but it just went away. So can you start with the initial introduction while this comes up?
Has it come now? Okay, if it's a problem, I'll just I'll manage without it. So thank you very much, Dr. Rakesh Kumar, and thank you to Mumbai First for inviting me to be part of this event, especially coming on top of the recent launch of the Mumbai Climate Action Plan. I hope this event, which brings together so many stakeholders from so many different sectors and so many countries, contributes to enlarging the discussion, deliberation, and action on climate change, especially with reference to Mumbai. In several studies over the last 15-20 years, the Mumbai city and Mumbai metropolitan region has emerged as among the most vulnerable and at-risk cities as far as climate change and climate-related disasters are concerned. And what we see is that this kind of climate exposure to climate change risk is only partly because of climate change. The disasters are also a consequence of unplanned urbanization, and then also severe environmental degradation, and much of it, unfortunately, also led by a large-scale illegalities, especially as far as the coastal regulation zone norms are concerned, including by the state and by businesses and a range of other actors. And therefore, Amitav Ghosh, the writer, going with Adam Sobel, the Columbia scientist, prediction says Mumbai is likely to face something like the triple disaster that Fukushima faced. It's also important that we go beyond the very tired old debates about economic growth versus environment, because by now, and this is, I'm citing a study carried out by IIT Bombay in collaboration with OECD, which talks about the billions of dollars of losses that we face, that cities face, like Mumbai, because of climate change. And of course, the losses are not only economic, there are specific groups who are already vulnerable because of their caste, class, gender, migration status, and their location in the city, who are much more vulnerable because they live in very dangerous and marginalized, fragile ecological areas. And therefore, we have suggested that methodologically also, whether you're looking at finance or any other aspect of climate change, it's very important that you look at how groups which are already facing marginalization or discrimination, how they become more vulnerable because of exposure to climate change risks. So it's important that when we talk about climate change and how to address climate change and climate action plans, we don't restrict ourselves to the very obvious and well-known exposure to climate risks, but how these integrate with various urban development projects to result in particular kinds of risks for different sections of the population, for different parts of the city. And therefore, it's important that we do not understand climate change only in terms of sea level rise or cyclones or storm surge. There is a very clear interaction and interface between urbanization itself and atmospheric processes. There is a feedback between land and atmosphere, and therefore every intervention in the city, every small intervention, whether it is a coastal road or a metro railway or clearance of trees, everything has an impact on the local climate. And it's very unfortunate that many of the projects which are being planned or which have already come into existence have simply not looked at this science at all. And therefore, there is a danger of severe risks to the city and different parts of the city and different populations in the city because of this failure to look at this science much more closely when we plan these different infrastructure and urban development projects. And therefore, you have all these kinds of adverse impacts of urbanization, infrastructure development, industrialization, and so on. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that climate change impacts interface with anthropogenic impacts of our own actions in urban development, and frequent flooding in the city is only one of the outcomes of this interaction. Skip this. So therefore, to continue with this point that I was making about the complexity of climate change, it's not just climate change at the global scale that's affecting a city like Bombay, it's climate variability. And in one of our studies, we found that Mumbai region is among the most vulnerable. It's at the highest risk when it comes to vulnerability to climate variability and not just climate change. And this brings us to the question of something that we've been working on for a long time, on this idea of uncertainty because uncertainty in models, uncertainty in prediction, uncertainty in terms of variability has implications for how we think about policy when we're talking about climate action plans and policy. And these are reflected, for example, in the study, in fact, which we did with Dr. Rakesh Kumar of NEERI, that different kinds of scenarios of extreme precipitation events and water levels will yield us different kinds of scenarios of which parts of the city will get inundated. And that makes it very complex in terms of how to plan development in a city, but how to also put in place an action plan for climate change. So what does this uncertainty mean for us in terms of developing technological solutions? So these are the kind of questions that we need to ask. And one of the things that I'm proposing is that maybe we also need to think of not financing certain projects at all as a way of coping with climate change, and maybe instead reroute to ecosystem protection and restoration rather than for infrastructure or other kinds of projects. And therefore, when we are talking about various kinds of development plans, and this is one of the important critiques of the Mumbai Climate Action Plan, that we are still going ahead with a range of infrastructure and development projects without mainstreaming climate change, future risk scenarios, and the kind of issues that I was talking about in terms of land-atmosphere interactions, because these projects are themselves going to contribute to climate variability and change, extreme precipitation events in different parts of the city. Unless we do that kind of detailed analysis, climate financing, thinking about climate financing itself is not going to be very useful, because we're going to end up financing projects which will create more risks in the future. Therefore, and I'll end with this final perspective and giving a couple of examples. So in our projects, we've been working on this idea of transformation as a response to this uncertainty, going beyond adaptation and resilience, and drawing from the IPCC Assessment Report 5 about pathways to transformation, which we think of as something that is deliberate, that is holistic, that is inclusive, and not just think about finance and technology and coping and resilience in the short term, but how can we reimagine planning itself for the city such that it becomes much more sustainable. And here we are borrowing from the well-known work of Karen O'Brien about how, and this is where I think I also linked to Mr. Atul's comments earlier, that these transformations have to take place at multiple levels, at the political, at the personal, and at the practical. And we've carried out different experiments and action projects to show how this can work for the city of Mumbai. So this is the project that I'm drawing from, the Tapestry project that's just coming to an end now. So one is about flood risk governance, where we are saying that engineering solutions, solid waste management, stormwater drainage, these are not going to work. A transformative approach would move away from that kind of individual adaptation and usual coping approaches towards developing a more holistic approach for city planning to mitigate the risk of flooding. Likewise, we are saying that future risks have to be incorporated at every stage, in every sector, in every sphere, whether it is institutions, urban development plans, the social sector, or even in terms of meteorological predictions, and how these can be integrated to develop a better, more transformative approach to flood risk mitigation arising from climate change in the city of Mumbai. And also, we did a study in Dahisar, near the Dahisar River, which is one of the areas which gets flooded every year. And we looked at a very interesting set of activities where local citizens, with the help of the municipal ward officials, NGOs, scientists, have come together to understand flooding and then bring about a transformation in the absence of a larger strategy from the municipal corporation itself, how at a very local level this kind of transformation is happening. So based on an understanding of this, we think that there is scope for scaling this up to the city or the regional level, and we can learn about the transformative pathway for a climate action plan at a very local level. We also have been studying the Mangrove public interest litigation, which is a very important governance transformation in Bombay, led by the High Court and several environmental activists, which led to a change in how we think about mangroves and their role in environmental protection and as a safety guard against flooding arising from sea level rise, stormwater surge, and so on. Finally, we looked at one of the Kolivadas, the fishing villages in Warsaw, and through a range of what we call as co-produced knowledge exercises, we're focusing on very specific activities related to creek cleaning as a source of way of restoring livelihoods, mangrove protection, using technology for recycling plastics, and coming up with an alternative master plan, which we again think could be scaled up to the city level as a different way of thinking about the relationship between the coastal wetlands and the coastal ecosystems and the city at large. So this co-production is what I would like to offer as a way of capacity building, as a way of thinking about an alternative way of addressing vulnerability for coastal cities like Mumbai. That is, instead of producing risks, which is what all of these projects that I mentioned in the slide below, in the points below. So these are important economic growth projects. They also create a lot of risks. But how can we think about development while also protecting the ecosystems in Bombay, which provide us significant services, including disaster risk reduction services? And therefore, one way of would be to restore these different kinds of links between the coastal environment and the livelihoods. How mangroves are not just about livelihoods or the ecosystem, they're also about disaster risk mitigation. How to bring in greater linkages between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So we need to transform ourselves to be more inclusive, to use science much more, and to develop different kinds of alliances. So, for example, why are there no judges or lawyers or environmental activists or even people from the community, from fishing communities who are badly affected by climate change at this event, for example? So that is what co-production involves, and that's why we need these kinds of alliances and networks to address climate change related risks. So I'll end with this to say that a transformative approach requires particular ways of understanding vulnerability, particular approach to adaptation, but a different way of thinking about finance, about solutions, about adaptation, and so on. And this requires that we are much more inclusive and we are much more prepared to work with others with whom we may not agree and bring in alternative perspectives about development, about addressing climate change related risks. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Pasarthi. I think you brought the real essence of the discussion that we started this morning, where it was being discussed that we need to integrate almost all discipline and almost everything that we're doing. And of course, the debate of mangrove protection also hinges on the other protection of the ecosystem species, which is what some people need to understand, that it is an integrated ecosystem. So on one side, when we do protection of mangroves and we do not do desiltation of creeks, we have flooding situation. So I think this is something which needs to be understood in an integrated manner. Thanks a lot for your time and the effort that you made, and you waited quite long for your lecture. Thank you very much. Now I'll move on to the next speaker in this session. We have Mr. Abhinash Mohanty. He's Program Lead of Risk and Adaptation at Council of Energy, Environment and Water, CU. And so you know the time limit, if you can manage. We have exceeded a bit of it earlier. Thank you.
Vulnerability index at a pan-Indian district level using the integrated vulnerability framework. And what did we find? We found that more than 95% of the coastal Indian districts are extreme event hotspots, and number is really grave. Whereas 75% of Indian districts are extreme event hotspots, the Indian coastline is highly exposed to all the three hydromet disasters. And if we look at the class of disasters, then cyclone, flood, drought, cyclone and drought, flood and cyclone, flood and drought, these are the combinations that these coastal regions are suffering upon. Then comes the question. We have been talking of evolving risk landscape. Interestingly, we tried doing a downscaling of our model to understand how the microclimate change is swapping across. And just to put things into perspective in terms of numbers, 45% of Indian districts are showcasing a swapping trend. That is, traditionally flood-prone areas are becoming drought-prone, or drought-prone areas are becoming flood-prone, or kind of simultaneously they are witnessing flood and drought. And that is what, in fact, in the morning, Honorable Minister also highlighted that while they were trying to mitigate drought situation, we had flash floods to manage. And this is where 60% of the coastal Indian districts are witnessing a swapping trend. And not to our surprise, most of the swapping trend districts are also kind of housed across Maharashtra. If we kind of understand what exactly is the adaptive capacity, what exactly is the sensitivity range, and what exactly is the exposure range of Indian districts, then that gives us the state of vulnerability across coastal districts in India. More than 80% of Indian districts are highly vulnerable to compounding impacts of extreme event. Then what does this mean? This actually means that every 4 out of 10 people living in coastal Indian districts are highly vulnerable to all the three extreme events, hydromet disasters to be precise, and there has been a 5-fold increase in frequency and intensity of the extreme cyclones across the western coast only in the last decade compared to the eastern coast, because across eastern coast, cyclones are a very normal phenomenon, at least every year you witness, but now in last decade, western coast is also witnessing the cyclones. Then what do we do? So here is a quick fix in terms of tried and tested framework, analytical framework that we have been working upon for some time now. If you have to mitigate some of these risks, then we have to understand coastal risk management in terms of understanding it from a 6I framework and implementing the 6I framework, which calls for identification. The first and foremost thing is identifying risk at a hyperlocal level, because very rightly Mr. Srinivasan has said that Mumbai as a city is different and metropolitan Mumbai is different, so that hyperlocal element needs to be brought in. Inclusiveness, which includes accessibility, availability, and adaptability across all communities, genders, and geographies, what Dr. Parthasarathi also highlighted, that vulnerable genders, communities are somewhat impacted. Then we need to bring in innovations, and innovations should be classed across 3 types. System innovations, which talks of policy changes and what Maharashtra is rightly doing across that, followed by technological innovations that are community driven and not just kind of innovations that are talk of the town. And then we need to have financial innovations as well, so that we can have right kind of risk financing. While we are talking of these innovations, they need to be integrated into our national, subnational, and now at Maharashtra we have city-level plans as well, which needs to be intervened into building resilient infrastructures and integrating nature-based solutions. What rightly you asked Mr. Bakay about some of the solutions as a question, and what Mr. Bakay was also referring to is not just talking of ecosystem-based approaches, but what exactly within the ecosystem-based approaches are going to come up in terms of bringing an investment. Rightly, Dr. Rakesh, you also said that it's not about financing, it's about investing. And when we talk of investing, it should be more led from a just transition side. And that is where it calls for a coastal climate risk commission. All the coastal regions should come together to have this climate risk commission, so that we have right 6I framework implemented that is community-led driven, and we are actually building some sort of integration and practice. With this, I'm looking forward to the questions, and I end my presentation. I hope I was on time. Thank you.
Thank you. That helps a lot. It's also true for climate action. If you are not done on time, then you are in trouble. So all the past sins actually are, accumulating, and the present generation faces it. We can take a couple of questions for these three speakers. First, Dr. Atul Bakay has already gone. We took the question. But to Professor Parsarthi and Dr. Mohanty, if it's not, then we can go to the next part of the. Any questions to Dr. Mohanty? Okay, so we can take it to the later part of it.